They buried the screams beneath the frost. They called it Salem, a village built on prayer and paranoia. But what the records never told you is that something ancient woke there in 1692. Not hysteria, not delusion, an awakening. 13 women, marked not by witchcraft, but by knowledge forbidden to their world. The kind that bends the will of kings, the kind whispered before empires burn. History tells you they were executed, but graves were never found for half of them. Only scorched soil, salted as if to keep something from rising again. The trials were not justice, they were containment, a desperate purge orchestrated by men who feared what these women had uncovered, a ritual written in a dying tongue, a covenant that turned pain into power. It was called the Salem Pact. It wasn't worship of the devil, that's the lie they fed the frightened masses. It was reclamation. A binding of will and shadow, an act of revolt against the invisible chains that ruled them, the church, the crown, and the unseen hand behind them both. For centuries, whispers of that pact have been erased, rewritten, buried under sermons and schoolbooks. But traces remain, in diaries that never reached public record, in bloodlines that never faded, in the strange disappearances that shadow New England's oldest families. You were never supposed to hear this, because the moment you do, something stirs, a quiet memory in your blood, like the echo of a name you once knew. The women of Salem did not die. They changed form. They hid within generations, passing on the pact not through spells, but through understanding. The knowledge that control is an illusion, and fear is a weapon forged by the powerful to cage the awakened. Tonight we unseal that cage. We trace the hidden lineage, the forbidden scripture, and the vengeance that history tried to erase. Because the witches didn't curse the world, they cursed the ones who burned them. And if you listen closely, you'll feel it too. The awakening hasn't ended, it's only begun. They said the flames purified the town, but fire never purifies. It only reveals what's real beneath the smoke. The records talk about testimony, confession, repentance. But read between the lines and you'll see a different ritual playing out. Fear made holy, obedience made sacred. The judges weren't merely men of law, they were instruments. Every question, every accusation was written like liturgy, a psychological script designed to break will. The women of Salem became experiments in control, their trials a rehearsal for every institution that would rise after: church, state, empire, corporation. The pact became a myth because it had to. You can't rule a population that remembers where its power lies. So they turned the memory of resistance into a cautionary tale. They told us witches were evil, so no one would notice what had really burned. The idea that authority could be questioned. Centuries later, the same pattern repeats with new costumes. The words change: patriot, worker, consumer, citizen. But the spell remains the same. Give us your fear, and we'll protect you from it. The machine feeds on panic, and Salem was its prototype. Think of the courtroom, the candles, the murmured prayers, the crowd trembling at every accusation. That's what control looks like when it's dressed as salvation. And if you listen to certain echoes in modern life, the headlines that pit neighbor against neighbor, the slogans that trade reason for outrage, you'll hear that same chant: confess, conform, obey. But beneath that chant is a counter-rhythm, faint, steady, impossible to erase. It's the rhythm of those who saw through the performance and refused to kneel. The women of 1692 may be gone in body, but the question they asked still burns: who profits from your fear? That question is the ember that never went out, and it's the one that starts the next descent. After Salem, the fire didn't die, it learned discipline, the same fear that on CE lived in wooden courtrooms, and whispered accusations began to wear new uniforms. Ministers gave way to bureaucrats, gallows to papers stamped with seals, sermons to policies. The colonies grew into a republic, but the logic of the trials, control through panic, became part of the new nation's bloodstream. Witch hunts became loyalty tests. Every generation needed an enemy to keep the order intact. One century it was heresy, another, communism. Today, it's whatever slogan the moment requires. The names change, but the hunger stays the same. In the archives you can trace it. The the slow perfection of fear as technology, pamphlets giving way to newspapers, radio, television, algorithmic feeds, each step more efficient at dividing, at reminding you that safety lies only in surrender. And the people learned to crave it. To be watched was to be protected, to be accused was to be seen. They built their own gallows on screens, traded shame for belonging, outrage for purpose. The Salem model had gone digital. But in every age, there are those who feel the pattern tightening and refuse to play their part. They sense that history is not progress, but repetition, an echo chamber built on old spells. Those who resist don't shout. They listen. They hear the silences between headlines, the empty spaces between laws, the moments when the performance slips. And when it slips, something ancient peers through. Not witches, not demons, but awareness itself. The part of the human spirit that remembers freedom not as permission, but as presence. That awareness is dangerous because it cannot be taxed, drafted, or sold. It asks questions that unravel systems. It's what the Salem Pact was really about, remembering the mind's sovereignty. The story you've been told is that civilization moved on from its superstitions. The truth is that it perfected them. Salem wasn't the end of an age of darkness, it was the blueprint for the light that blinds. And the question now isn't whether the fire still burns, it's whether you can see what's feeding it. When the trials ended, the officials spoke of closure. They drafted apologies, offered restitution, and declared the horror behind them. But in the shadows of those gestures, the architecture of something enduring began to take shape. The same men who had condemned the accused now gathered in meeting houses and private lodges. They spoke of order, of moral vigilance, of maintaining the fabric of society. Out of that language grew the early blueprints for the networks that would define the new world. Religious councils, mercantile alliances, secret fraternities. Each claimed to defend virtue, but virtue was just another word for control. These groups understood what the Salem Panic had proven. If you could define the threat, you could define the truth. So they began to study fear scientifically. They learned which symbols triggered obedience, which stories made people surrender their judgment. They mapped the psychology of loyalty. As the colonies hardened into a nation, those maps guided everything: education, law, even the pulpit. The ministers preached of sin, the politicians preached of enemies. Both spoke the same tongue of division. The New World promised freedom, but only under management. The chaos of Salem had taught them what happens when people think for themselves. Behind the parchment ideals and the marble monuments, a quieter script was written: train the citizen, shape the narrative, define the boundaries of acceptable thought. Every era would call this by a different name: patriotism, progress, security. But the code beneath never changed. You can see it in the architecture of early universities, modeled like cathedrals. You can hear it in the oaths sworn by public servants, written to sound noble but built to bind conscience to hierarchy. Even the press, born in the name of liberty, learned quickly that access depended on obedience. They didn't need gallows anymore. They had ideals. And beneath those ideas lay the same equation that burned in 1692: fear, authority, faith. The formula was perfected, institutionalized, replicated across centuries. Most people will never question it, but those who do, those who notice the repetition, feel it like a pulse under the nation's skin. The same nervous rhythm that began in Salem, beating softly beneath every promise of freedom. Revolution changed the flag, not the structure. The new republic declared itself free, but its leaders understood what freedom really meant: a resource too volatile to leave unmonitored. The Salem formula was still useful, it simply needed refinement. Instead of priests invoking damnation, editors now invoked patriotism. Instead of trials by fire, there were committees, censuses, registries. The gallows became paper and ink. The flames turned into ideas that burned slower, deeper. By the early 19th century, the industrial city replaced the village. Steam and smoke hid the same choreography. Hierarchy at the top, fear at the bottom, faith in between. Factory whistles marked the hours like church bells once had. The sermon was now the schedule. The rulers of this new order didn't claim divine right, they claimed efficiency. but the psychology was the same. Keep the worker grateful, the citizen anxious, the population distracted. Teach them to measure their worth by compliance, to find safety in repetition. Education became the first true mass experiment in mind design. Rows of desks, bells, rote recitation, all modeled on the drill grounds of the military and the pews of the chapel. It looked like progress. It felt like preparation. The lesson beneath every lesson was obedience disguised as order. And when the factories multiplied, so did the dreams they sold. Advertising learned to speak the language of salvation. It promised meaning through consumption, identity through allegiance to products, belonging through brands. The old sermons of sin and grace were now slogans of failure and success. The same principle that drove the witch hunts drove the assembly line, shape perception, harvest belief. If the people could be taught what to want, they could be governed without chains. By the end of the century, control no longer needed a courtroom. It lived inside every mind trained to confuse comfort with truth. The ancient machinery of fear had gone internal. That's the moment the true descendants of the Salem idea, those who sensed the pattern, began to look not outward, but inward. They understood that liberation wouldn't come from overthrowing rulers, but from dismantling the scripts written inside the self. And that's where the next descent begins. By the dawn of the 20th century, control had learned subtlety. No torches, no trials, just headlines, slogans, and the quiet hum of machines that told people who they were. The new architects of influence didn't wear robes or crowns. They wore suits. They called themselves public relations experts, social engineers, advertisers. They studied the mind the way earlier rulers studied scripture, looking for the sentences that could summon obedience. War gave them their laboratory. Propaganda turned terror into unity, death into duty. Posters and radio broadcasts taught millions to feel the same emotion at the same moment. It was magic disguised as communication. When peace returned, those methods didn't disappear. They were privatized. The same techniques that once sent soldiers to battle now sent shoppers to stores, voters to ballots, citizens to screens. Desire became a lever, fear a commodity. The individual was no longer punished for heresy, he was rewarded for conformity. And the most powerful trick of all was this: they made the cage invisible. They told people they were free because they could choose between brands, between candidates, between channels. But choice without awareness is still captivity. Every broadcast, every advertisement, every promise of progress was a whisper: stay asleep. Because an awake populatio doesn't consume the way a frightened one does. An awake mind can't be owned. That's why every era has its distractions. Wars of opinion, spectacles of outrage, cycles of crisis that keep the population circling the same emotions. The shape of the spectacle changes, but its purpose never does. To keep attention outward, away from the quiet space where real perception begins. And yet, in the cracks between those spectacles, people still glimpse something raw and unfiltered. The recognition that their thoughts aren't fully theirs. That feeling is dangerous. It's the same realization that shook Salem 3 centuries ago, the sudden, terrifying sense that the story isn't true. That's the moment awakening begins, and the system knows it. That's why it always fights hardest when someone starts to see. Every story of control has a moment when the mask slips, when the machinery behind the curtain hums too loudly to ignore. For some people, that moment feels like betrayal. For others, like birth. Look closely at your own timeline. Think about the first time you realized that official explanations never quite fit the evidence, that headlines contradicted themselves, that institutions sold certainty the way merchants sell salt. Maybe you brushed it off, told yourself it was cynicism, but that whisper didn't leave, it grew teeth. That's how awareness begins, not as rebellion, but as a question too heavy to silence. And questions are the one thing every empire fears. So here you are, listening to a story about a forgotten village and a pact buried under 3 centuries of shame. But you already sense it isn't really about witches or history. It's about inheritance, about the part of you that still feels the pull of truth when every screen screams distraction. If you understand that, if you feel that pulse of recognition, mark it. Leave a trace in the comments so others can find you. Write the phrase, "I see the pattern," not as allegiance, not as ritual, but as evidence that you're awake. Do it twice if you have to, not for the algorithm, but for the mirror. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once enough people see, the pattern fractures. That's why the architects of control work so hard to drown awareness in noise. The more people who awaken, the harder it is to sell fear. The harder it is to sell obedience. In every age, there have been those who saw through the illusion and paid for it with exile, ridicule, or silence. But awareness never dies. It migrates. It hides in plain sight, waiting for eyes clear enough to recognize it. You found this story for a reason, not by algorithm but by resonance. And now that you're here, the descent can deepen. Awareness never spreads like rumor, it spreads like erosion, quietly. It doesn't topple towers, it weakens their foundations until the weight of their own lies does the work. After every awakening comes a counter-movement. The powerful don't panic, they adapt. They rename, rebrand, and re-educate. When people start questioning the message, the system changes the language. Censorship becomes curation. Surveillance becomes safety. Obedience becomes unity. It's an old dance. The same rhythm that beat through Salem's gallows now pulses through cables and satellites. Control no longer needs chains, it needs narratives. Every new platform, every policy, every campaign promising protection carries a small clause that says, "Trust us with your fear." That's how awareness gets contained. It's wrapped in irony, turned into entertainment, fed back to the public as spectacle. The rebels of one decade become the advertisements of the next. The message is diluted until it's safe to sell. But even containment leaves residue. Somewhere in every generation, someone reads the fine print. Someone sees that security means permission, that connection often means exposure. They notice how the architecture of the digital world mirrors the courthouse of 1692. Everyone watching, everyone judging, everyone afraid to speak first. History keeps repeating because it keeps working. Fear organizes, curiosity fragments. So long as people mistrust each other more than the systems guiding them, the structure holds. But there's a catch the engineers of control can't fix. The human mind is built for pattern recognition. Every algorithm that learns our habits also teaches us to see the design. Each time the mask shifts, more people glimpse the seams. That's where change starts, in perception, not protest. The Salem women didn't invent rebellion, they simply refused to forget what they'd seen. Awareness isn't revolution, it's preparation. And if you've made it this far, you're already part of that erosion. You don't need permission to keep looking deeper. The act of looking is the resistance. When the outer world is too visible to rule, control turns inward. The 20th century ended with cameras on every corner, but the real surveillance was never the lens. It was the mirror. The next frontier wasn't land or labor. It was identity. If you can define what a person is, you don't have to command what they do. The mind will enforce its own obedience. Institutions learned this slowly, through wars and markets and revolutions that refused to stay dead. They realized that direct domination burns too hot. It creates martyrs, and martyrs create memory. But redefine identity, and you erase rebellion before it begins. Education shifted again, not to inform but to form. The goal wasn't knowledge, it was narrative. Teach every child not who they could be, but who they should be. Replace discovery with ideology. Replace individuality with image. By the digital age, the experiment was complete. People no longer needed to be silenced. They curated their own voices to fit the accepted pattern. The witch hunts returned, but this time no one called them that. They called them trends. Mobs formed without torches, guided by data instead of doctrine. The crowd still burned heretics, it just did so with ridicule and isolation. Every like, every label, every public confession became a trial transcript. We judge, we confess, we perform. We've become both the accuser and the accused, and beneath it all the same machinery hums, control through reflection. Feed the ego 1,000 mirrors, until it forgets which one shows its true face. The Salem women were condemned for refusing to play the role assigned to them. In their defiance, they touched a truth modern men have forgotten. That identity defined by power is not identity, but imprisonment. To escape this prison, you don't destroy the mirrors. You stop mistaking them for windows. You remember that perception isn't reality, it's conditioning. And that realization, dangerous and simple, is what every system of power fears most. Because the moment you define yourself on your own terms, the entire hierarchy begins to shake. When identity becomes the currency of control, collapse is inevitable. You can't trade symbols forever without someone asking what they're worth. The information age promised liberation, every voice amplified, every truth accessible. But it also became the perfect storm for fragmentation. Everyone could speak, yet no one could listen. The world turned into an echo chamber of curated outrage, and the signal got lost in the noise. That's how power survives chaos, it multiplies it. A divided population doesn't need chains, it builds them. Each faction clings to its own narrative, convinced it's rebelling, unaware it's performing the same ritual of fear and certainty. The Salem courtrooms have gone digital, thousands of them, alive on every feed, every day. But in the middle of that storm, something strange happens. When everything is noise, silence becomes magnetic. When every voice screams for validation, authenticity becomes rebellion. The pendulum begins to swing. People start to notice how every outrage is timed, how every crisis fits the rhythm of attention economics. They begin to feel the fatigue of performance, the hunger for something real beneath the slogans. That hunger is dangerous. It's what empires can't quantify, because once people stop reacting, they start seeing. They start connecting dots. How the news cycle mirrors advertising, how fear guarantees profit, how confusion breeds dependence. Awareness becomes contagious again, not through mass movements but through quiet recognition. And that's when the cracks appear. Algorithms misfire. Narratives contradict. The illusion of authority trembles under its own contradictions. The architecture of belief begins to look less like a fortress and more like a stage set built from borrowed fear. You can feel it in the air now. That collective unease, the sense that something immense is shifting but no one can quite name it. The same feeling that hung over Salem before the trials began, and again after they ended. History doesn't repeat, it replays the same lesson until it's learned. Every era is a test of perception. Will you see the pattern or play your part in it? The answer determines not the future of a nation but the fate of a mind. The moment you realize the pattern, paranoia waits for you like a trap. Every era of awakening dangles that same poison. See enough, and you start to doubt everything, even yourself. That's how control renews itself. It sells confusion as freedom. To reclaim perception, you have to walk a narrow path between cynicism and belief. One side swallows you with despair, the other with delusion. The balance is awareness without hysteria, vision without obsession. The first step is noticing what you consume. Information is the modern sacrament. What you feed on shapes what you worship. Each headline, each scroll, each outrage is an offering. Ask who profits from the emotion you're asked to feel. Trace the ownership behind the message and you'll see the same few hands turning the wheel. The second step is reclaiming silence. Not withdrawal, not ignorance, silence as a weapon. In quiet, the noise reveals its outlines. You start to see how each fear is scripted, each miracle timed, each division incentivized. Silence lets you watch the play instead of acting in it. The third step is remembering scale. Systems of power want you to feel small, helpless, isolated, but the same networks that monitor you also depend on your attention to exist. Every time you withhold it, when you stop reacting, when you refuse the bait, you steal momentum from the machine. Awareness doesn't mean believing in invisible masters or secret orders. It means seeing how visible systems function. It means recognizing manipulation as design, not fate. The Salem trials showed what happens when fear overrides discernment. The modern world shows what happens when discernment is outsourced entirely. Reclaiming perception isn't heroic, it's uncomfortable. It's the daily act of looking at the world without letting it define you. You won't find purity there, only clarity. But clarity is enough. It's the beginning of agency. And when enough people practice that kind of seeing, the structure that feeds on blindness begins to starve. Not from violence, not from revolt, from inattention. That's how control ends. Not with flames, but with focus. When you begin to see clearly, history stops feeling distant. It becomes immediate, alive inside every decision. You start to recognize the old architecture in modern walls, the courtroom in the office, the sermon in the advertisement, the gallows in the comment thread. Nothing has vanished. It has only changed costume. Awareness doesn't lift you out of the system. It lets you see the gears turning. And once you see them, you start to move differently. You speak slower. You choose what to give your attention to. You understand that outrage is a form of currency, and you stop spending it so easily. The first sign of awakening isn't rebellion, it's restraint. The ability to pause before reacting, to ask who benefits when you do. In that pause, centuries of conditioning lose their grip. Power notices. It always does. The moment people stop feeding on distraction, new distractions appear. More noise, more crisis, more stories designed to make you forget you ever had a choice. But awareness doesn't need armor, it needs consistency. It survives by remembering. That's why the real inheritance of the Salem women was never vengeance or mysticism, it was endurance. They represented the refusal to let fear dictate thought. Their story, stripped of myth, is a reminder that control collapses when people stop performing the roles it assigns them. When you reach that level of perception, you stop mistaking power for strength. You start to see that most authority survives only because people agree to fear it. Once fear dissolves, the illusion thins. From there, something subtle shifts inside you. You stop seeing history as a straight line of events and start feeling it as a pattern of awareness, rising, falling, rising again. Each generation forgets, and a few remember. Those few keep the thread alive. You're part of that thread now. The descent has changed direct. It's no longer downward into darkness, but inward toward comprehension. The more you see, the less you need to fight. Because real power isn't about domination. It's about perception that cannot be manipulated. Awareness is quiet at first. It doesn't look like revolution, it looks like hesitation. Meetings that end in silence. Policies questioned instead of accepted. People starting to ask why instead of how. Every shift in consciousness begins this way, not with a roar, but with the stillness of recognition spreading from one mind to another. At first it feels fragile, like a rumor that can't be proven, but that's its strength. You can't outlaw a feeling, and you can't censor a question that hasn't yet been spoken. When enough people share that silent recognition, systems begin to lose traction. Markets tremble, not from rebellion, but from indifference. Propaganda falters when audiences stop reacting. Leaders lose power when their words no longer ignite fear. The structure depends on response. When response fades, so does control. History records revolutions in blood and fire because that's what the victors understand. But the most profound revolutions have always been perceptual. The end of an age never begins with collapse. It begins when people no longer believe the story that sustains it. You can sense that moment now, hidden beneath the noise of endless updates and crises. The sense that belief itself is breaking down, that the official narratives no longer hold the gravity they once did. Institutions still perform their rituals, but the audience is restless. The spell is weakening, and in that space between collapse and creation, something vital emerges: possibility. When belief systems fail, imagination returns. People start experimenting again, with thought, with meaning, with community unbound by fear. That's why every power structure fights to keep awareness isolated. It can't be defeated, only divided. If each person thinks they're the only one seeing the cracks, they'll stay silent. But when they recognize each other, the silence becomes signal. That signal is spreading now, through art, through conversations, through the refusal to accept panic as normal. It's the same signal that flickered beneath Salem's ashes, a collective remembering that fear is optional. When that remembering reaches critical mass, history bends, not toward utopia, but toward honesty. And honesty is something no empire survives for long. Living awake is not heroic, it's uncomfortable. The world still moves to the rhythm of illusion, and you can hear the beat even when you stop marching. The advertisements still glow, the slogans still pulse, the crowd still cheers. You just can't forget what you've seen. Awareness doesn't grant superiority, it grants responsibility. Once you see how fear is manufactured, you have to decide what to do with it. Do you mock the asleep, or do you learn patience? Do you hide in cynicism, or do you build quietly in the gaps? The choice is constant, and it's heavy. You start to notice how small choices shape the pattern. What you buy, what you share, what you allow to occupy your attention. Every click is a vote for the kind of world that continues. Every word you speak either reinforces the story or fractures it. That's the real battlefield, not ideology but attention. To live awake is to guard your focus as though it were sacred. It means learning to dwell in ambiguity without losing integrity, to feel fear without surrendering to it. It's not rebellion in the old sense. It's craftsmanship, shaping a mind strong enough to remain clear in fog. This clarity has no anthem. It doesn't trend. It spreads through example, through the calm voice in a room full of panic, the patient gesture in a culture built on outrage. Each act of calm perception weakens the machinery that feeds on noise. You will feel alone at times. Every person who's ever stepped outside the collective dream has felt that isolation. But solitude is bayou. Air perception strengthens. It's where you relearn to think in your own voice. The women of Salem stood alone too. They weren't saints, they were human beings who refused to repeat the lies demanded of them. Their defiance echoes not because of sorcery, but because every age produces its own trials. The setting changes, the sentence doesn't. To live awake is to walk through those trials without losing empathy, to see clearly and still choose to build, not burn. That's where transformation begins, not in destruction, but in discernment. After every collapse, something has to be built. Awareness alone can strip away illusion, but it can't replace it. Once the noise fades, you're left with an empty field. No instructions, no authorities, just the question of what to grow there. Most people rush to rebuild the same structures they've just escaped. They crave the comfort of certainty. But creation born from awareness moves differently. It doesn't imitate the old, it experiments. It tests every foundation before trusting it. To create awake is to design without domination. It begins small, in conversations that allow doubt, in work that values precision over performance, in communities that reward honesty more than agreement. Each act is a quiet correction to the centuries of manipulation that trained people to trade truth for safety. Real creation isn't rebellion against the system, it's independence from it. It doesn't seek permission or recognition. It grows beneath the radar, where algorithms can't measure meaning. It's art that heals instead of distracts, business that serves instead of extracts, science that questions instead of confirms. The architects of control fear that kind of creativity, because it can't be owned. It doesn't rally crowds or seek approval. It spreads through integrity. You can't weaponize integrity. You can only witness it. That's why every genuine act of creation is subversive. It proves that life can organize itself without manipulation. It reminds people that systems were never sacred, they were inventions, and what was invented can always be reinvented. This is how awareness matures. First you see the pattern, then you stop feeding it, and finally you build outside it. You become the evidence that another mode of existence is possible. It's quiet work. It doesn't demand applause. But history turns on those quiet pivots. When enough individuals start building with clarity instead of fear, the atmosphere of a civilization changes. The world won't notice right away. It never does. But the vibration shifts. The noise grows thinner. The machinery hesitates. And somewhere, in the unseen spaces between headlines, a new rhythm starts to form. Steady, grounded, unafraid. That's the sound of renewal. The legend of Salem ends where every legend does, in silence. The fields that once echoed with accusation are quiet now. The wood has rotted, the names have faded from stone, but the air still carries something, a reminder that fear was never exorcised, only rebranded. What survived was not a curse. It was a lesson written in fire. When people surrender judgment to panic, they create their own prisons. And when they reclaim perception, they walk free, even in chains. The women who stood accused didn't win in their lifetime. They weren't vindicated by history. They were buried by it. But the idea that lived through them, The refusal to let fear define truth escaped the noose. It traveled through centuries, wearing new faces, whispering the same challenge, see for yourself. That's the real Pact of Salem. Not magic, not vengeance. Awareness passed forward through story. Every time someone recognizes manipulation and chooses clarity, the Pact renews. Every time someone listens instead of reacting, another spell breaks. Freedom was never a gift from rulers or a product of revolutions. It's a state of perception. It begins when you stop outsourcing meaning to institutions built on fear. It deepens when you learn to hold answer. Tainty, without collapsing into it. That kind of freedom can't be advertised or measured. It lives in the quiet conviction that no authority, not government, not market, not algorithm, can define the limits of thought. It's not rebellion, it's responsibility. The machinery of control will keep trying to resurrect itself. It always does, but it only works on those who forget that fear needs followers. Awareness has no followers, only practitioners. So when you finish this story and the screen goes dark, remember the real descent isn't into darkness, it's into sight. The eyes adjust, the noise fades, and in that stillness you can finally hear your own mind again. That's where the Salem Pact truly survives, not in history, but in anyone who chooses to stay awake, to think clearly, to build without fear. The flames are gone, the light remains.